The evening at Maple Creek Diner unfolded like any other, filled with the comforting sounds of clinking silverware, the murmur of familiar conversations, and the occasional burst of laughter from a well-told story. The scent of home-cooked meals drifted through the air, a rich blend of sizzling bacon, fresh brewed coffee, and the unmistakable warmth of meatloaf and mashed potatoes, a house special that had been a staple on the menu for years. The diner was cozy, its soft yellow lighting casting a gentle glow over the checkered tablecloths and the old-fashioned counter where regulars sat, sipping their coffee and exchanging small-town news. The radio hummed low in the background, a country ballad playing softly, blending seamlessly into the evening's rhythm. At the far end of the counter, the Henderson brothers, both in their late 60s dressed in their usual flannel shirts, were deep in conversation about the latest high school football game, their coffee cups never more than half empty before a waitress instinctively refilled them. Mrs. Thompson sat at her usual booth, carefully cutting into a slice of apple pie, pausing between bites to glance at the crossword puzzle she had spread across the table. Near the window, a young couple leaned in close, sharing a plate of fries, their hushed whispers lost beneath the gentle din of the diner's steady hum. Behind the counter, Talia moved with practiced ease, balancing plates on her arm as she wove between tables, her mind already cycling through the orders still to be delivered. The air was warm, carrying the promise of comfort and routine, and for the moment, everything inside Maple Creek Diner was just as it should be. JD Vance stepped into Maple Creek Diner, and the familiar chime of the doorbell announced his arrival. The warm scent of grilled food and freshly brewed coffee enveloped him instantly, mingling with the faint aroma of maple syrup and fried potatoes. The air carried a subtle hum of quiet conversations, the clinking of forks against plates, and the gentle twang of an old country song playing from the overhead speakers. It was the kind of diner he had always liked. Simple, unpretentious, the kind of place where people came for good food and a brief respite from the outside world. The glow of hanging lights reflected softly against the checkered tablecloths, and the polished chrome stools at the counter gleamed under the warm overhead bulbs. His stomach tightened with hunger, reminding him that he hadn't eaten since breakfast. The place was comfortably filled, with a few older men nursing their coffee at the counter, a young couple sharing a plate of fries in the corner, and a woman flipping through a newspaper while absent-mindedly stirring her tea. A waitress with curly brown hair, balancing 3 plates along her arm, caught his eye and gave him a friendly nod. "Sit anywhere you like," she called out, before disappearing into the kitchen. JD chose a small booth by the window, its seat slightly worn from years of customers sliding in and out. He picked up the laminated menu, running his fingers along the edges, scanning through the familiar comfort food options. The house special, meatloaf with mashed potatoes, caught his eye, stirring a memory of his grandmother's cooking. He allowed himself a small smile, thinking of cold nights when a warm meal like that made everything feel a little easier. This was exactly what he needed after a long day. Something hearty, something familiar, something that tasted like home. Melissa stepped out from the kitchen, wiping her hands on her apron, her mind focused on the evening's orders. She barely glanced toward the dining area at first, her attention on the ticket slips hanging by the counter. But then, out of habit, her gaze swept across the booths. The moment her eyes landed on JD Vance, she froze. Her body tensed, her breath catching in her throat as recognition hit her like a jolt of electricity. Her fingers, still dusted with flour, curled into her apron as her jaw tightened. A flicker of something sharp crossed her face. Disbelief? Anger? Perhaps even resentment. For a second, she just stood there, unmoving, as if trying to confirm that it was really him sitting in her diner, scanning the menu like any other customer. Then, with quick, purposeful steps, she turned toward the counter where Talia was preparing coffee. "Talia?" Melissa called, her voice tight but hushed. Talia looked up, sensing the tension immediately. "Come here," Melissa said, motioning her over. Talia hesitated, setting down the coffee pot before stepping closer. "What is it?" she asked, her eyes flicking between Melissa and the booth where JD sat. Melissa leaned in, lowering her voice. "That's him," she murmured, her tone edged with something unreadable. "JD Vance." Talia's eyes widened slightly, her fingers tightening around her notepad. She glanced toward JD, who was still oblivious to the quiet storm building across the room. "Are you sure?" "Of course I'm sure," Melissa said, crossing her arms tightly. I know exactly who he is." The easygoing hum of the diner had started to shift. Conversations at nearby tables quieted as a few customers picked up on the tension radiating from Melissa. The warmth of the evening had been replaced by something else, something heavy, something unspoken. And for the first time that night, the air inside Maple Creek Diner felt charged, like the moments before a storm. Melissa took a steadying breath and walked toward JD's booth, her steps firm and deliberate. The din of conversation in the diner had already quieted as nearby customers sensed the tension in the air. Talia stood frozen behind the counter, gripping her notepad, her stomach twisting in unease. She had worked for Melissa long enough to know that once her boss made up her mind, there was little room for negotiation. JD looked up as Melissa stopped at his table, his expression neutral, though his eyes flickered with curiosity at her stiff posture. Before he could speak, Melissa exhaled sharply and said, "I'm sorry, but I can't serve you here." Her voice was even, but there was no mistaking the steel underneath. JD blinked, caught off guard. "I'm sorry?" he asked, his brow furrowing slightly. Melissa straightened her shoulders. "I know who you are, Mr. Vance," she said, her voice firm but not raised. "I don't agree with your politics, and I don't feel comfortable having you in my diner." She crossed her arms, her fingers pressing into her elbows as if bracing herself. "This is my business, and I have the right to decide who I serve." A heavy silence filled the space between them. The clink of a spoon against ceramic somewhere in the background suddenly felt too loud. A man at the counter set his coffee cup down with a quiet but deliberate clink. Talia could see other customers glancing at one another, unsure whether to keep eating or to watch the moment unfold. JD studied Melissa for a long moment, his face unreadable. He could have argued. He could have made a scene. Instead, he simply set the menu down, folded his hands on the table, and nodded once. "I understand," he said quietly. His calm response seemed to catch Melissa off guard. Talia saw the flicker of uncertainty in her boss's eyes, just for a second. JD rose from the booth, adjusting his jacket, then looked at her. "Thank you for your honesty," he said before turning toward the door. The bell jingled as he stepped outside, leaving behind an uncomfortable stillness. JD Vance stepped outside into the cool evening air, the bell above the door jingling softly behind him. The warmth of the diner, the smell of coffee and home-cooked food, the quiet murmur of conversation, all of it faded the moment the door swung shut. He stood still for a moment, his hands resting on his jacket, inhaling deeply as he let the tension in his chest settle. He had walked into that diner expecting nothing more than a hot meal, a brief respite from the day's demands. Instead, he had been reminded, yet again, of how deeply divided the world had become. He glanced back through the window, the golden glow of the diner's lights casting long shadows against the pavement. Inside, people were still watching, their conversations hushed, their expressions varying between discomfort, curiosity, and quiet judgment. At the counter, Talia's fingers clenched around her notepad, her knuckles white. Her stomach churned with unease, her mind replaying the moment over and over. Melissa's unwavering stance, JD's composed reaction, the lingering silence that had swallowed the diner whole. She wanted to say something, do something, but what could she say now? The decision had been made. Melissa, standing stiffly near the counter, felt the weight of her choice pressing against her chest. Her arms remained crossed, but her fingers twitched slightly, as if second-guessing what she had just done. She had expected anger, an argument, a confrontation. But JD had given her none of that. His quiet acceptance unsettled her more than if he had lashed out. The lingering eyes of her customers only made it worse. Some nodded approvingly, others looked uncertain, while a few exchanged murmured words, their expressions unreadable. Outside, JD took one last glance at the neon glow of the diner's sign, then reached for his phone, scrolling through his contacts. His stomach still ached with hunger, but now there was something heavier sitting inside him. He pressed call. "Hey," he said after a few rings. "I think I found the place." He paused, looking at the diner once more before turning toward his car. "Yeah? Tomorrow works." The evening at Maple Creek Diner unfolded as predictably as any other, a comforting routine that wrapped around the small-town eatery like a well-worn blanket. The warm glow of the overhead lights reflected off the checkered tablecloths, casting a golden hue over the booths and counter stools where regulars had settled in for their usual meals. The rich scent of frying bacon, freshly brewed coffee, and the subtle sweetness of maple syrup lingered in the air, mixing with the buttery aroma of biscuits baking in the oven. The sizzle of burgers on the grill blended seamlessly with the occasional clatter of plates and silverware, all underscored by the familiar hum of an old country song playing from the radio mounted above the counter. The voices of the customers, though varied, formed a steady, rhythmic murmur that filled the space without overwhelming it. At the counter, old Mr. Jenkins sat nursing his black coffee, his weathered hands wrapped around the mug as he listened to the Henderson brothers argue over the latest high school football game. Their voices, deep and animated, carried over the sound of the radio, their debate intensifying every few minutes before breaking into bursts of laughter. A few seats down, a middle-aged woman named Mrs. Thompson carefully sliced through her apple pie, her crossword puzzle open beside her, occasionally pausing to jot down an answer in neat, cursive letters. In the farthest booth, a young couple leaned toward each other, their hands barely brushing as they shared a plate of fries, lost in quiet conversation. Near the kitchen, Talia moved between tables with practiced ease, refilling coffee cups before customers even had to ask, offering warm smiles and casual small talk that made the diner feel more like home. She balanced a tray with 3 steaming plates, delivering meatloaf and mashed potatoes to a table where an older man and his granddaughter were enjoying their weekly dinner out. The girl, no older than 10, kicked her feet under the table as she eagerly poured ketchup onto her fries, her grandfather watching her with a fond smile. Behind the counter, Melissa worked the register, occasionally glancing toward the kitchen, where Hector flipped pancakes with a steady hand, his radio playing faintly beneath the sound of cooking. Everything moved like clockwork, the diner functioning as it always had, a place untouched by the chaos of the outside world. Conversations ebbed and flowed, from local gossip about Mrs. Whitman's new fence to discussions about the upcoming town fair. The scent of freshly baked rolls drifted from the kitchen, carrying with it a feeling of warmth, of familiarity. Outside, the sky had deepened into a rich indigo, the neon open sign casting a soft red glow onto the damp pavement where puddles from the afternoon rain reflected the light. No one in the diner could have predicted how the evening would shift in the next few minutes, how the entrance of one man would disrupt the steady rhythm they all took for granted. For now, everything was normal, steady, peaceful. Just another night in Maple Creek Diner, before the moment that would change everything. JD Vance pushed open the door of Maple Creek Diner, and the familiar chime of the overhead bell announced his arrival. The warmth of the place hit him immediately, a stark contrast to the cool evening air outside. The scent of sizzling bacon, fresh coffee, and something sweet, maybe a pie cooling in the kitchen, filled his senses, triggering a flicker of nostalgia. It was the kind of diner he had always appreciated, the kind that didn't try too hard to impress, where the food was simple but satisfying, and the faces were familiar even if you'd never met them before. The overhead lights cast a soft glow over the space, bouncing off the worn linoleum floor and reflecting in the chrome-rimmed stools at the counter. A country song hummed low from the radio, barely noticeable beneath the steady murmur of conversation and the occasional clink of forks against plates. JD took a step inside, glancing around as he adjusted the sleeve of his jacket. The booths along the window were half filled with regulars, their heads dipping in conversation, their hands wrapping around steaming mugs. At the counter, an older man nodded to the waitress as she refilled his coffee, while a young couple in the corner leaned close, sharing a plate of fries. Everything about the place felt easy, familiar, like stepping into a world untouched by the fast pace and sharp edges of life beyond its doors. JD exhaled quietly, shaking off the weight of the long day, and made his way toward a booth by the window. He slid into the seat, the vinyl cushion creaking slightly beneath him, and reached for the plastic menu tucked behind the napkin dispenser. Flipping it open, he ran his fingers over the laminated surface, scanning the options, though he already knew what he was looking for. The house special, meatloaf with mashed potatoes and green beans, caught his eye, stirring something in him. It had been years since he'd had a home-cooked meal like the ones his grandmother used to make, and suddenly the idea of something hearty, something simple and familiar, seemed more appealing than anything else. His stomach tightened in hunger as he considered adding a slice of apple pie to finish it off, but before he could decide, the soft sound of footsteps approached his table. A waitress, balancing a tray of dishes on one arm, paused just long enough to offer him a smile. "Sit anywhere you like," she called, already moving toward the next table. JD nodded, though she was already gone, disappearing behind the counter where another waitress stood pouring fresh coffee. The evening stretched ahead of him, and for a brief moment he let himself settle into the atmosphere, appreciating the quiet hum of the place, the warmth, the familiarity. He had only wanted a meal, nothing more, just a brief pause in his evening before continuing on. But as he turned the page of the menu, unaware of the eyes that had just landed on him from across the room, he had no idea that his presence had already shifted something in the air, that in a few short minutes this peaceful routine would be upended in a way no one inside had anticipated. Melissa stepped out of the kitchen, wiping her hands on her apron, her mind focused on the usual demands of the evening rush. The comforting rhythm of the diner buzzed around her, the sizzle of burgers on the grill, the hum of conversation, the occasional scrape of forks against plates. But something, an instinct perhaps, made her glance toward the booths near the window. Her breath caught mid-step, her fingers freezing against the fabric of her apron as her gaze locked onto a familiar face. JD Vance. The name formed in her mind instantly, unshakable, undeniable. The laminated order slips in her hand suddenly felt heavier, her jaw tensed, her shoulders stiffened, and the easygoing warmth she carried while managing the diner evaporated in an instant. She barely noticed the way her hands clenched into fists at her sides. Her heartbeat picked up, pounding in her ears as she processed what she was seeing. Him, sitting there like any regular customer, scanning the menu with the kind of relaxed ease that suggested he had no idea whose space he had just walked into. A rush of emotion surged inside her. Resentment, disbelief, a flicker of something deeper she didn't want to name. She had seen his face on TV, read about his politics, heard the way people in town argued about him. And now, JD Vance was in her diner, her father's diner, a place that had stood as a quiet sanctuary for people like her family. People who had been hurt by policies she believed he represented, and he had the nerve to sit there, expecting service as if none of it mattered. Melissa inhaled sharply, turning on her heel toward the counter, her movements tight, controlled. "Talia," she said, her voice clipped but low enough not to attract attention just yet. Talia, who had been refilling the coffee pot, glanced up and instantly caught the look in her boss's eyes. "What's wrong?" she asked, setting the pot down carefully. Melissa leaned in, lowering her voice. "That man," she muttered, jerking her chin subtly toward JD's booth. "That's JD Vance." Talia blinked, her brows knitting together as she followed Melissa's gaze. Her reaction wasn't immediate recognition, but when the name clicked, her eyes widened slightly. "Are you sure?" Elissa nodded once, lips pressed into a thin line. "I know who he is." Her voice was firm, but there was an edge to it, a restraint holding something back. Anger, nerves, maybe both. Tally hesitated, glancing between JD and Melissa. "So, what do you want to do?" she asked cautiously, already sensing that this wasn't going to be just another order ticket. Melissa exhaled slowly, straightening her shoulders. "I don't want him here." The certainty in her tone made Talia's stomach twist, and for the first time that evening the air in the diner felt heavier, more charged. Conversations at nearby tables continued, oblivious for now, but something was shifting beneath the surface. Melissa had already made up her mind, and Talia could feel it. The moment of confrontation was coming, and the easy, predictable flow of the evening was about to break. JD Vance barely had time to glance up from the menu before Melissa was standing at his table, her arms crossed tightly over her chest, her stance firm like a barrier between him and the rest of the diner. Her face was carefully composed, but there was no mistaking the tension in her jaw, the fire simmering just behind her eyes. The noise in the diner had not yet fully died, but at the tables nearest to them, conversation softened, forks hovered above plates, and a quiet, uncertain energy began to ripple through the space. JD set the menu down, his expression shifting into one of mild curiosity. "Evening," he said, his voice polite, measured. "Can I get a coffee?" But Melissa didn't reach for a notepad. She didn't move to pour him a cup. Instead, she exhaled sharply, as if steadying herself. "I'm sorry," she said, and though her voice was even, there was an unmistakable weight behind it. "But I can't serve you here." A flicker of confusion crossed JD's face, but he kept his posture relaxed, his hands resting loosely on the table. "I'm sorry?" he asked, as if he had misheard her. Melissa straightened, standing taller, reinforcing her resolve. "I know who you are, Mr. Vance," she said, her voice clear but not loud. "I don't agree with your politics, and I don't feel comfortable having you in my diner." Her fingers curled slightly against her forearms, as though bracing for impact. "This is my place," she continued, "and I have the right to decide who eats here." A heavy silence settled over the diner like a thick fog. The low hum of conversation that had filled the space moments ago had all but disappeared. At the counter, an older man set his coffee cup down with a quiet clink, his gaze shifting toward the confrontation unfolding before him. Talia, standing behind the counter, felt her breath catch, her fingers tightening around the rag she had been using to wipe down the surface. She didn't know what she expected JD to do. Argue, push back, demand to be served. But he didn't. Instead, he held Melissa's gaze for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Finally, he exhaled quietly, nodding once. "I see," he said simply. There was no anger in his tone, no sharp edge of indignation, just quiet understanding. His calm response seemed to catch Melissa off guard. Her jaw tensed, as if she had been prepared for a fight that never came. JD reached for the menu, carefully folded it, and placed it back in its holder. He moved slowly, deliberately, as if refusing to let the moment escalate. "It's your business," he said, his voice low, controlled. "Your choice." He slid out of the booth, adjusting his jacket with a smooth motion. Melissa didn't say anything. She just watched as he straightened, standing a little taller than she had realized. JD met her eyes one last time, his expression unreadable, and then, with a small nod, he added, "Thank you for your honesty." And with that, he turned and walked toward the door. The bell jingled softly as he stepped outside, leaving behind a diner full of people who weren't sure what to say. JD Vance stepped outside into the crisp evening air, the bell above the diner door jingling softly behind him, signaling his quiet departure. The warmth of Maple Creek Diner, the scent of home-cooked meals, the muffled sound of clinking plates and murmured conversation, everything now seemed distant, like something he had momentarily stepped into only to be pushed back out again. He paused for a brief moment on the pavement, inhaling deeply, his hands settling into the pockets of his jacket as he glanced through the large front window. Inside, the world continued, yet he could feel the shift he had left behind, a subtle but undeniable disturbance in the air. The conversations that had once hummed comfortably now carried a different weight, hushed, cautious, uncertain. Some customers still picked at their meals, their gazes flicking toward the door, toward the booth he had occupied just minutes ago, whispering their thoughts in quiet tones. Others kept their heads down, trying to pretend nothing had happened, but the stiffness in their shoulders betrayed them. Behind the counter, Talia felt a pit in her stomach, her fingers still gripping the rag she had been using to wipe the counter as if it could somehow ground her in the moment. She had known Melissa for years, respected her as a boss, but something about what had just happened unsettled her in a way she couldn't shake. JD hadn't yelled, hadn't argued, hadn't made a scene. He had simply accepted Melissa's words with quiet dignity and left. And yet, despite the absence of conflict, tension still clung to the air like an unwelcome presence. She stole a glance at Melissa, who stood rigidly by the counter, arms crossed, her expression unreadable. Melissa exhaled slowly, staring at the door as if expecting JD to turn back, to say something else, to give her the confrontation she had braced for. But he didn't. Instead, all she was left with was the weight of her own decision. Her stomach twisted, though she told herself she had done the right thing. This was her diner, her choice, and she had stood by her principles. And yet, as the silence in the diner stretched, she could feel the way her employees avoided her gaze, the way customers shifted uncomfortably in their seats. "I can't believe he just left like that," someone at the counter muttered under their breath. Another voice chimed in, hesitant. Yeah, I thought he'd say something. Across the room, a couple exchanged glances, the woman shaking her head. Did she really have to do that? She whispered, but loud enough for others to hear. Melissa heard it too, but she refused to acknowledge it, keeping her expression blank. She wouldn't second-guess herself. Not now. Not in front of everyone. But deep inside, something about the way JD had responded, his quiet restraint, his simple acceptance, unsettled her more than if he had reacted with anger. As she turned back toward the kitchen, gripping the edge of the counter just a little too tightly, she wondered why, despite getting exactly what she wanted, she didn't feel as certain as she thought she would. JD Vance sat in his car outside Maple Creek Diner, his hands resting on the steering wheel as he stared through the windshield at the neon open sign glowing in the window. The warmth of the diner's interior, the smell of coffee and fresh biscuits, the murmur of conversations, all of it was behind him now, and yet the weight of what had just happened lingered. He had been turned away before, dismissed, insulted, but this was different. The way Melissa had looked at him, her unwavering stance, the quiet tension that had settled over the room as the customers bore witness to the moment, it wasn't just about him. It was about something larger, something deeper, something that reflected the way people had begun to see one another as enemies rather than neighbors. He could feel frustration stirring inside him, a flicker of something sharper, something that urged him to lash out, to fight back, to call out what had happened. But instead, he reached for his phone and opened his social media app, his fingers hovering over the keyboard as he considered his next move. He could have written an angry post, a call for outrage, a demand for boycotts. He knew how quickly it would spread, how easily people would take his side and flood the diner's page with criticism. But as he sat there, the cool air of the night pressing against the glass, he let that impulse settle. That wasn't who he was. That wasn't who his grandmother had raised him to be. Instead, he thought about the diner itself, the way it had felt when he first walked in, the small-town charm, the sense of community, the comfort of a place that had likely served generations of families. He thought about Talia, the waitress who had looked uncomfortable but kind, and the way customers had exchanged uneasy glances, as if unsure whether they agreed with Melissa's decision. The truth was, this wasn't a bad place. It was a place run by someone with strong beliefs, just as he had strong beliefs, and in a divided world, that was bound to lead to moments like this. His fingers began to move over the screen, crafting his message carefully. Was turned away from this little gem in Oakwood last night because the owner didn't agree with my politics. Respect her right to refuse service, but trust me, folks, their meatloaf special smelled amazing, and everyone inside looked happy. Small businesses are the heart of America, even when they don't want my business. If you're in the area, give Maple Creek Diner a try and form your own opinion. Support local, always. He read it over twice, feeling the weight of each word. It wasn't an attack, wasn't an attempt to stoke division. It was an invitation, a challenge, a reminder that kindness could exist, even in disagreement. With a final breath, JD tapped the post button, then set his phone down. Whatever happened next was out of his hands. At first, JD Vance's post seemed like just another passing comment on social media, a quiet observation that might catch the attention of a few followers before fading into the endless stream of online chatter. But within an hour, it had begun to pick up traction. The simplicity of the message, the unexpected restraint in his words, and the way he had framed the situation. Acknowledging his rejection without bitterness, even encouraging people to visit the diner, struck a chord. People began sharing it, adding their own commentary, debating the implications. Some praised JD for his grace and maturity, seeing his response as an example of how people with differing views should treat one another. Others saw it as a call to action, rallying behind him with comments like, "This is ridiculous. No one should be denied service over politics," and "Let's flood this place with bad reviews." But not everyone took JD's side. Just as quickly, others defended Melissa's decision, arguing that business owners had the right to choose who they served. She did what she believed in. Why should she be forced to serve someone whose views she opposes? One comment read. Another countered, "People like JD have power, influence. If he had different beliefs, he'd be applauded for taking a stand. And so, as the post continued to spread, it became more than just a story about a small-town diner. It became a symbol, a battleground for the ever-growing divide in American culture. Soon, news outlets picked up on the viral discussion. At first, it was just local journalists, small-town blogs speculating about the incident at Maple Creek Diner. But by the next morning, national media had caught wind of the debate. Headlines began appearing. JD Vance denied service at small-town diner. His surprising response. And restaurant owner refuses to serve senator over political beliefs, fair or overreach. Cable news shows debated the issue. Commentators dissected JD's words, and radio hosts took calls from listeners eager to weigh in. The diner's online pages were bombarded with reviews, some from people who had never set foot in the town, let alone eaten at the restaurant. Some praised Melissa for standing her ground, others condemned her as intolerant, and still others planned to visit the diner just to support or protest her decision. As the debate raged, JD remained silent, refusing to engage further, letting his original words stand on their own. But the world around him wasn't as willing to let it go. What had begun as a quiet, personal moment in a small-town diner had become something much bigger, something no one, least of all Melissa, was prepared for. The morning after JD Vance's post, Maple Creek Diner woke up to an unexpected storm. At first, Melissa didn't even realize what had happened. She arrived early, as she always did, unlocking the door, flipping the sign to open, and starting the coffee pot without a second thought. But as the minutes passed, something felt off. Her phone, which she usually ignored until after the breakfast rush, kept buzzing with notifications. Talia walked in, her eyes wide, holding up her own phone. "Have you seen this?" she asked, her voice laced with both shock and apprehension. Melissa frowned, drying her hands on her apron before glancing at the screen. And there it was. JD's post, now shared tens of thousands of times, with comments flooding in from every direction. By the time the first customers arrived, the phone in the diner was ringing constantly. Reporters calling for statements, strangers from out of town asking about their hours, and a few calls that Melissa declined to answer after hearing the hostility and the voices on the other end. Outside, a small crowd had begun to form. Some were just curious locals who had heard the buzz, but others held their phones up, filming, narrating the controversy, as if it were a spectacle unfolding in real time. Melissa felt an uncomfortable weight settle in her chest. She had expected some backlash, maybe a few heated words from customers who had strong opinions about what she had done, but this was something entirely different. Talia and the other employees whispered among themselves, unsure of what to make of it. "Is this good or bad for business?" one of the cooks muttered, watching as more people walked in than usual for an early Tuesday morning. "I have no idea," Talia admitted, glancing at Melissa, who stood stiffly behind the counter, her jaw tight. The surge of attention was overwhelming, and yet, it wasn't entirely negative. Some people were coming in specifically because of the post, eager to try the diner JD Vance had inadvertently endorsed. Others walked in cautiously, as if they had stepped into a piece of history unfolding. But for every supportive customer, there were others who watched Melissa with scrutiny, waiting to see if she regretted her decision. By noon, news vans had arrived. A local reporter knocked on the door, camera crew behind her. "Melissa, do you have a comment on JD Vance's post?" she asked, microphone extended. Melissa exhaled sharply, gripping the counter so hard her knuckles turned white. She had made a decision, one she had believed in, but as she looked at the chaos around her, the packed booths, the murmured debates, the flashing cameras, she couldn't shake the feeling that somehow she had lost control of her own story. The days following JD Vance's post turned Maple Creek Diner into something it had never been before. A destination. What had once been a quiet, reliable spot for locals to grab a meal had suddenly become the center of a viral controversy, and the surge of customers reflected that shift. By the next morning, the parking lot was fuller than usual, and by lunchtime there was a line out the door, something that had never happened in the history of the diner. Inside, the atmosphere was a strange mix of excitement and tension. Some people came in with curiosity, eager to see the diner they had read about online, while others entered with clear intentions, either to support or to challenge Melissa's decision. Talia and the other waitresses barely had time to catch their breath. The kitchen, usually running at a steady and manageable pace, was now in a constant rush, with Hector flipping pancakes and grilling burgers faster than ever. Orders stacked up, coffee pots emptied quicker than they could be refilled, and the ringing of the register was nearly non-stop. "This is insane," one of the new hires muttered as she carried out a tray of plates, her face flushed from the heat and pressure. "I thought this was supposed to be a slow town." Talia shot her a sympathetic glance, but had no time to respond. She was already rushing to clear a table for the next wave of customers. Melissa, usually confident and in control, now found herself struggling to keep up. She had spent years worrying about not having enough business, and now, for the first time, she was facing the opposite problem. Too much attention, too many people, too much scrutiny. Some customers were friendly, expressing their support, ordering meals and praising JD's post for bringing attention to a small-town establishment. Others were more direct in their opinions, asking her outright if she regretted what she had done, if she would change her policy, if she would serve JD if he walked back through the door. Melissa had no answers for them. She simply worked, punching in orders, wiping down the counter, avoiding the news cameras stationed outside. By the end of the first full day of this chaos, when the last customers had finally left and the lights were dimmed for closing, Melissa sat heavily at the counter, rubbing her temples. Talia placed a fresh cup of coffee in front of her, sliding into the stool next to her. "You okay?" she asked, her voice softer now that the noise had died down. Melissa sighed, staring at the now empty diner. "I don't know," she admitted. "I thought I was making a stand, but now I don't even know what this is anymore." She looked toward the door, where a news van was still parked across the street, its headlights casting long shadows against the pavement. Her diner was no longer just a diner, it had become a symbol, whether she wanted it or not. And for the first time, she wasn't sure if that was a good thing. Melissa sat in her office, the door slightly ajar, listening to the distant clatter of plates and the steady hum of conversation in the diner beyond. It had been days since JD Vance's post had turned her small-town restaurant into the center of a national debate, and yet she still felt like she was standing in the eye of a storm. Business had never been better. There were more customers than ever, the cash register was full, and the once struggling diner now had a waiting list nearly every meal rush. And yet, despite the financial success, a heaviness sat in her chest. An unshakable weight that she couldn't quite name. She had made her choice. She had stood by her beliefs. So why did it feel like she had lost control of the very thing she had tried to protect? A knock at the door pulled her from her thoughts. Talia peeked in, hesitant. "Hey, do you have a second?" she asked. Melissa exhaled and nodded, motioning for her to come in. Talia closed the door behind her, shifting her weight uncomfortably. "Look, I know this is your decision, your business," she started carefully, "but things feel different, and not in a good way." Melissa leaned back in her chair, rubbing her temples. "I know," she admitted, her voice quieter than usual. "I thought I was making a statement, that I was standing up for something. But now, I don't even know what I've created. This place, it doesn't feel like my diner anymore." She gestured vaguely toward the front, where the buzz of customers continued. "I wanted to stand my ground, but I didn't want it to turn into this." Talia hesitated before speaking. "I think people are just looking for a fight. They're making this about more than just food, more than just you. But the thing is," she paused, "what happens next is still your choice." Melissa looked at her employee, appreciating the honesty in her words. For the first time since that night, she wondered if she had been so focused on making a point that she had forgotten what actually mattered, and if there was still a way to take back control of her own story. Melissa found the cream-colored envelope tucked between the usual stack of bills and business letters, her name written in neat, slanted handwriting across the front. She stared at it for a long moment, her fingers hovering over the edge before finally peeling it open, unfolding the single sheet of paper inside. The letter was simple, direct, and yet, as she began to read, she felt an unfamiliar tightness in her chest, as if the words on the page carried more weight than she was prepared to hold. "Dear Ms. Hargrove, first, I want to thank you for your honesty when I came to your diner. In a world where people often hide their true feelings, your directness was refreshing. Melissa swallowed hard, already feeling something stir inside her, something she had been trying to ignore since the night she had turned him away. My grandmother taught me that when someone rejects you, the best response is kindness, not because it makes you look good, but because it recognizes that everyone has reasons for their actions, reasons we may not fully understand. I didn't recommend your diner to embarrass you or to win sympathy. I did it because, even from my brief time inside, I could see that Maple Creek Diner is special. The way your staff look to you for guidance, the smell of real home cooking, the photos of local kids on your bulletin board. These things matter. They remind people that small businesses like yours are the heart of America. Melissa felt her throat tighten. He had noticed. Not just the food or the confrontation, but the small things. The things she had built over years of hard work. The things she had taken pride in long before any of this had happened. My politics come from wanting to help struggling communities like yours. We may disagree on the methods, but I believe we want the same things. For people to have good jobs, safe neighborhoods, and hope for their children's futures. I don't ask you to change your mind about me, or even to serve me if I ever return. That is your right as a business owner. I only ask that you keep doing what you're doing, serving good food and providing a place where your town can come together. That matters more than any political disagreement. Sincerely, JD Vance. Melissa exhaled slowly, staring at the words as if they might shift under her gaze, as if there was something hidden between the lines that she had yet to understand. She had expected anger, she had expected bitterness, maybe even sarcasm. But this was something else entirely. Kindness, grace. The very thing she had been so sure she was defending when she refused him service. And yet now, she wasn't sure at all. Folding the letter carefully, she set it down on the counter, her fingers lingering over the paper. Outside, the diner was busy as ever, the clatter of dishes and the low hum of conversation filling the air. But for the first time in days, Melissa felt something shift inside her. Not regret, not defeat, but the slow, unsettling realization that maybe, just maybe, she had been looking at this all wrong. Talia sat on the couch, absent-mindedly scrolling through her phone, her mind still lingering on the chaos of the past few days at the diner. She had just finished telling her grandmother Eliza about JD Vance's letter to Melissa when something Eliza said made her pause. His grandmother taught him that kindness is the best response to rejection, Talia murmured. Thinking back to the words JD had written, she glanced over at Eliza, who had gone completely still in her chair, her wrinkled hands resting lightly on her lap. "What did you say?" Eliza asked, her voice softer, tinged with something unreadable. Talia hesitated. JD Vance said his grandmother used to tell him that when someone rejects you, the best thing you can do is respond with kindness. She frowned slightly, watching as something flickered across Eliza's face, something deep, something old. "Grandma?" she prompted, sitting up straighter. Eliza didn't respond right away. Instead, she reached for the worn blue photo album that she kept on the side table, her fingers trembling slightly as she flipped through the pages. Talia watched as her grandmother landed on a faded black and white photograph. Two teenage girls sat on a porch step, arms draped around each other, grinning at the camera. One of them was unmistakably a younger version of Eliza. The other girl, with wild, curly hair and an untamed, determined expression, looked unfamiliar. "That's Beverly," Eliza said quietly. "JD Vance's grandmother. We grew up together." Talia's breath hitched. She leaned forward, staring at the photograph, the weight of the revelation settling heavily on her chest. "Wait, what? You knew his grandmother?" The realization hit her like a bolt of lightning. Eliza nodded, her expression distant as she traced the outline of Beverly's face with a gentle touch. "We were best friends," she murmured. "Thick as thieves. We did everything together. Back then we had nothing except each other in our dreams." She smiled faintly, lost in memory. She always had fire in her, stood up for people, never backed down. But she had a soft side, too. She believed in giving people second chances. That's why, when you told me what JD wrote, I knew it had to come from her. Talia swallowed hard, trying to process it all. This wasn't just some distant historical connection. This was personal. Does he know? She asked. Eliza shook her head. I don't think so. We lost touch years ago. Life took us in different directions. She sighed. But I never forgot her. For the first time since the controversy at the diner had begun, Talia felt like something deeper was at play, something bigger than just a political divide. This wasn't just a story about conflict. This was a story about connection, about the past intertwining with the present in ways none of them had expected. And suddenly, she knew she had to tell JD. Eliza leaned back in her chair, running her fingers over the edges of the faded black and white photo, her eyes glistening with memories long buried beneath the years. Beverly and I were just kids when we met, she began, her voice steady but distant, as if she were reaching back through time to a place that no longer existed. Kentucky summers were hot and endless, and back then we didn't have much, just dusty roads, hand-me-down dresses, and a whole lot of dreams we thought could carry us anywhere. She let out a small chuckle. Beverly was always the braver one. She had this wild, untamed spirit, like a fire that never dimmed, and if she saw something wrong, you best believe she wasn't going to just stand there and let it happen. Talia sat forward, listening intently, fascinated by this new window into the past. Eliza smiled faintly, lost in the memory. There was this one time, when we were about 12. We used to walk home from school together every day, past Old Man Crawley's general store. One afternoon we saw a group of boys throwing rocks at a stray dog. Just this skinny little thing, ribs showing, barely more than a pup. I wanted to keep walking, didn't want trouble, but Beverly? She marched straight up to those boys, hands on her hips, and told them if they threw one more rock, she'd make sure they regretted it. Eliza laughed softly. And she meant it, too. Those boys knew better than to mess with her. They scattered like leaves in the wind, and you know what? That dog followed us all the way home. She named him Lucky, said he needed someone to stand up for him just like people do. Talia smiled, picturing the scene in her mind, but Eliza's expression turned more solemn. Life wasn't easy for us, she continued, her fingers tracing the edges of the photograph. Our family struggled. Some nights we didn't know if there'd be enough food on the table. But Beverly never let it break her. She used to tell me, we may not have much, but we've got grit, and grit will get you farther than money ever will. And she was right. She paused, inhaling deeply. When we got older, we had to make choices. I left town to train as a nurse, and Beverly stayed, built a life, raised a family. But no matter how far apart we were, I never forgot the way she stood up for people, the way she believed in second chances. That's why, when you told me about JD's letter, I knew it had to come from her. That's Beverly's way. She never let anger win. She always believed that kindness was the strongest weapon a person could carry. Eliza sighed, her eyes distant once more. I lost touch with her over the years, and I regret that. But seeing JD now, knowing that her lessons carried through him, it makes me feel like she's still here somehow, like her fire never really went out. Talia swallowed the lump in her throat, the weight of her grandmother's words settling deep in her chest. What had started as a controversy, a clash of ideals, was now something much more. A story that stretched back decades, a story of resilience, loyalty, and the unbreakable power of kindness, passed from one generation to the next. Talia sat on the edge of her bed, staring at the old photograph of her grandmother and Beverly Vance, her mind spinning in circles. The revelation had shaken something loose inside her, something she couldn't ignore. This wasn't just an interesting coincidence. It was a missing piece in a story that had spiraled out of control. And now she had to decide whether to share it with Melissa. The thought made her stomach twist uncomfortably. Melissa was proud, stubborn, and fiercely protective of her beliefs. She had built her identity around standing her ground, around refusing to compromise when it came to what she thought was right. Talia had seen it firsthand the night JD Vance walked into the diner, how Melissa's face hardened the moment she recognized him, how she made her decision without hesitation. Would she even care that their lives were connected in a way no one had expected? Or would she brush it aside, too caught up in her own convictions to see what it meant? Tally bit her lip, turning the photo over in her hands. She understood Melissa's frustration. She understood why she had felt the need to take a stand, why she had refused to serve JD. But she also couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't just about politics anymore. It was about something deeper, about people, about history, about the ways lives intertwined without anyone realizing it. If Melissa knew that JD's grandmother had been Eliza's best friend, would it change anything? Would it make her see him as more than just a politician she disagreed with? The problem was, Talia wasn't sure she wanted to find out. She had been working at the diner for 2 years, and in that time, Melissa had become more than just a boss. She had become someone Talia respected, someone she looked up to. Telling her about Eliza and Beverly felt like a risk, like she was challenging Melissa's decision in a way that could go very wrong. But wasn't that the point? Wasn't she supposed to challenge things when they didn't feel right? Her grandmother's words echoed in her mind. Everyone has a story, Talia. Everyone has reasons for what they do. Maybe this was Melissa's chance to see JD's story in a new way, to realize that the world wasn't as black and white as she had made it out to be. Maybe this was the push she needed to let go of the anger she had been carrying since the night she turned him away. Talia exhaled sharply, gripping the photograph tighter. She didn't know how Melissa would react, but she did know one thing. Keeping this to herself felt wrong. If there was even the slightest chance that knowing the truth could bridge the divide between them, then it was worth the risk. Decision made, she stood up, slipping the photo into her bag. Tomorrow, she would tell Melissa. And whatever happened next, she would face it. Because if there was one thing she had learned from her grandmother, it was that sometimes the hardest conversations were the ones that mattered most.
Melissa sat alone in the diner after closing, the only sound the quiet hum of the refrigerator and the occasional creak of the old wooden floor. The place, usually bustling with customers and chatter, now felt too big, too empty, as if the walls themselves were waiting for her to make a decision she wasn't ready to face. JD Vance's letter sat unfolded on the counter, its words replaying in her mind over and over again. He hadn't been angry. He hadn't called for a boycott or used the incident to humiliate her. Instead, he had extended something unexpected: understanding, kindness, and, worst of all, grace. And that unsettled her more than anything. She wanted to ignore it, to let it pass, to move on as if nothing had happened. But that was impossible. The diner hadn't been the same since that night. Business was booming, sure, but it wasn't the same kind of busy as before. There was an edge to it, a weight she could feel every time someone walked in, and glanced around as if searching for signs of controversy. She caught it in the way customers spoke in hushed tones, the way new visitors watched her a little too closely, waiting to see if she fit the image painted by the news stories. Even her staff was different, more cautious, more careful. And then there was Talia, who had been watching her all day, like she was waiting for Melissa to say something she hadn't yet figured out how to say. Just talk to him, Talia had finally said that afternoon after another long shift spent pretending things were normal. Invite him back. Have a conversation. What's the worst that could happen? Melissa had scoffed at the time, brushing it off. I don't need to fix this, she had replied, more to convince herself than anyone else. I did what I thought was right. But do you still think it was right? Talia had asked, and the silence that followed had been louder than anything Melissa had heard all day. Now, in the quiet of the empty diner, she let herself ask the question she had been avoiding. Had she been wrong? Had she let her pride, her anger, dictate a decision that wasn't about principle at all, but about proving a point? The thought unsettled her. If she invited him back, it would feel like an admission that she had made a mistake. And what would people think then? Would they call her weak? Would they say she was backtracking, giving in? But deep down, she knew the real question wasn't what other people would think. It was whether she could live with herself if she let this moment pass without doing the right thing. And that, she realized, was something she could no longer ignore. Melissa sat at the counter long after the diner had closed, a blank sheet of paper in front of her and a pen held loosely between her fingers. She had spent the past hour staring at it, trying to figure out what to say, how to say it, and more importantly, whether she even had the courage to put the words down at all. Apologizing wasn't something that came easily to her. She had built her life, her business, on standing firm, on knowing where she drew the line and refusing to cross it. But now she was starting to realize that strength wasn't just about holding the line, it was also about knowing when to step over it. She exhaled sharply and put the pen to paper, the first few words feeling heavier than they should. Dear Mr. Vance. No, too formal. She scratched it out and started again. JD. That felt better, at least a little. She tapped the pen against the counter, gathering her thoughts, then began writing in earnest. Thank you for your letter. Your kindness in the face of my rejection has made me reconsider a lot of things. I would like to invite you to dinner at Maple Creek Diner on Friday evening after we close to the public. I'd like to apologize in person and offer you the meal you were denied. She paused, chewing the end of her pen before continuing. There is also something remarkable I've recently learned. My waitress, Talia, her grandmother, Eliza, was best friends with your grandmother, Beverly. She has photographs, stories, and memories of the woman who helped raise you. She would love to share them if you're interested. She hesitated, then added one last line, the words feeling vulnerable but necessary. This is not a publicity event, no press, no cameras, just a chance to talk. She signed her name at the bottom, read over the letter twice, then folded it carefully and slipped it into an envelope. It wasn't perfect, but it was honest. That was all she could offer. By the next morning, Talia had delivered the letter through a trusted reporter who had been covering JD's visit to town. The waiting was the hardest part. Melissa found herself checking her phone more than usual, even though she hadn't given him her number. She tried to focus on work, on the customers, but her mind kept drifting back to the letter. Had he read it? Would he even consider coming back? That afternoon, as she wiped down the counter between shifts, her phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. Miss Hargrove, this is JD Vance. Thank you for your invitation. I would be honored to join you on Friday at 7. The connection to my grandmother is especially meaningful to me. May I bring dessert? Melissa read the message 3 times before she let out a slow breath, relief and nervousness tangling together in her chest. She had expected hesitation, even rejection, but instead, JD had accepted without question, and for the first time in weeks, she felt like she had taken the first step toward making things right. The day of the dinner arrived with a tension that hung in the air like the thick humidity before a summer storm. Inside Maple Creek Diner, the usual steady rhythm of the morning rush had felt different, quieter in some ways, charged in others. Melissa had gone through the motions as she always did, pouring coffee, checking deliveries, managing the kitchen, but her mind was elsewhere. Every so often, she would glance at the clock, her stomach twisting tighter as the hours inched closer to evening. She had invited JD Vance back into her diner, back into the very place she had once refused to serve him, and now the weight of that decision pressed down on her more than she had expected. The staff had picked up on the shift in the atmosphere. Talia moved between tables with a knowing look in her eyes, exchanging quiet glances with Hector in the kitchen and Danny at the register. They weren't just working, they were waiting, anticipating. Everyone knew what was happening tonight, even if Melissa hadn't explicitly announced it. The diner had been the center of so much division these past few weeks, but tonight, there was a fragile hope that something different might come from it, something better. Melissa tried to busy herself with preparations, determined to make the evening feel as normal as possible, though she knew deep down that nothing about this was normal. She had spent the last 2 days obsessing over the menu, tweaking the meatloaf recipe 3 times before settling on the version she thought was best. The mashed potatoes were whipped to perfection, the green beans cooked just right, the apple pie cooling on the counter, its scent filling the kitchen with warmth. It wasn't fancy, it wasn't extravagant, just good food, made with care, the kind of meal that could bridge a divide, if only she could let it. Meanwhile, Eliza sat near the window, her hands folded neatly in her lap, her eyes bright with a kind of excitement that Melissa couldn't quite comprehend. The elderly woman had arrived an hour early, dressed in a deep blue dress with a silver pin fastened at the collar, a pin, she had explained, that Beverly had given her on her 16th birthday. It was a small gesture, but one that carried decades of history, of friendship, of a connection that neither time nor distance had truly severed. I haven't felt this nervous in years, Eliza admitted with a chuckle as Talia poured her a fresh cup of tea. I wonder if he looks like her. Beverly always had those fierce eyes, like she could see straight through you. She exhaled, adjusting the delicate folds of her cardigan. I hope he remembers her the way I do. Will, Talia reassured her, though she was just as anxious about how the night would unfold. She had been the one to deliver the invitation, the one to watch JD's expression carefully as he read it. He had been surprised, perhaps even a little stunned, but not hesitant. If anything, there had been something almost reverent in the way he had responded, as if the discovery of his grandmother's old friend had given him something he hadn't even known he was searching for. As the clock neared 7, Melissa found herself fidgeting more than usual, adjusting the salt shakers, smoothing invisible wrinkles from the tablecloths, checking and rechecking the placement of the silverware. It was ridiculous, really. This was just dinner, just a conversation, and yet it felt like so much more. The other employees finished their closing duties, but no one left just yet. Danny lingered by the counter, pretending to wipe down menus he had already cleaned twice. Hector stepped out of the kitchen, stretching his arms as if casually observing the room. Even the youngest waitress, Sarah, a college student who had only recently started, seemed unusually invested. No one wanted to admit it outright, but they all felt the same thing, that tonight mattered in a way none of them could quite explain. Then, at exactly 6:55, the headlights of a car cut through the dimming evening outside, and just like that, the moment was here. Melissa's breath hitched slightly as she smoothed her apron, steeling herself. This was it. No turning back now.
The bell above the diner door jingled softly as JD Vance stepped inside, a bakery box tied with twine in his hands. The warmth of the diner wrapped around him instantly, the familiar scent of home-cooked meals, the low hum of soft music playing from the old radio, the flickering glow of the overhead lights. He scanned the nearly empty space, his eyes landing on Melissa, who stood by the counter with her arms resting stiffly at her sides. Talia and Eliza sat at a corner booth, the latter's hands folded neatly in front of her, the silver pin at her collar catching the light. "Melissa?" JD greeted with a nod, his voice even but unreadable. Melissa straightened, wiping her hands on her apron out of habit. "JD," she replied, her tone carefully neutral. A beat of silence passed before JD lifted the box slightly. "I brought pie," he offered. "Apple. Figured I owed you dessert after the way I left last time." That at least managed to break some of the tension. Melissa exhaled a quiet chuckle, shaking her head as she took the box from him. "No, well, I don't turn away free pie," she admitted, gesturing toward the booth. "Come on, we've got a table ready." JD slid into the booth across from Eliza, who was already studying him carefully. Talia took the seat beside her grandmother, while Melissa hesitated for a moment before sitting down across from JD. The first few minutes were filled with polite formalities, the kind exchanged between people who weren't sure whether they were meeting as adversaries or something else entirely. JD thanked them for the invitation. Melissa thanked him for coming, but the weight of what had brought them here lingered between them, thick and unspoken. Sensing the awkwardness, Eliza cleared her throat, drawing JD's attention. "You've got your grandmother's eyes," she said softly, offering him a knowing smile. Sharp, full of fire, she always had that look. Even as a girl, JD blinked, caught off guard. He turned fully toward Eliza, his posture shifting. "You knew her well?" Eliza's eyes twinkled. "Knew her better than I knew myself," she said. "We grew up together, shared everything." She was stubborn, that one. Wouldn't back down from a fight if she believed in something. She chuckled, shaking her head. "One time, she nearly knocked a boy's teeth out for making fun of my shoes. They were old, patched up. He called me poor, and Beverly, your grandma, gave him a bloody nose before he could finish laughing." JD laughed, a genuine, unguarded sound. "That sounds exactly like her." Melissa, who had been watching quietly, finally spoke. Talia told me about the connection, she admitted. I didn't know until a few days ago. JD nodded, studying her carefully. Would it have changed anything? Melissa hesitated, her fingers brushing against the silverware beside her. I don't know, she admitted honestly. But I do know that I judged you before I even let myself see who you were, and for that, I'm sorry. The silence that followed wasn't heavy. It was thoughtful, filled with something that resembled understanding. JD nodded once, accepting her words without hesitation. Thank you, he said. That means a lot. And just like that, the walls between them began to lower, brick by brick, over a meal that neither of them had expected would mean so much. As the meal wound down, the conversation between JD, Melissa, Eliza, and Talia had become more fluid, the tension of the evening melting away with each passing story, each shared memory of Beverly, and each bite of the homemade meal Melissa had carefully prepared. JD had listened intently to Eliza's recollections of his grandmother, his expression shifting between amusement, nostalgia, and something deeper. Something like gratitude. The apple pie he had brought sat mostly untouched between them, save for the few bites Talia had taken between refilling coffee cups. Then, as JD set his fork down and leaned back slightly, his tone shifted, signaling something more serious. There's something I need to tell you, he said, looking directly at Melissa. His voice was steady, measured, but there was an underlying weight to his words. The night I left here, after you turned me away, I sat in my car and made a phone call. Melissa stiffened slightly, instinctively bracing herself, though she wasn't sure why. A phone call? She repeated, her brows furrowing. JD nodded. To a friend of mine. He runs a small business investment fund that focuses on supporting local businesses in struggling communities. He paused, watching her reaction. I told him about Maple Creek Diner. Melissa's breath hitched slightly. She set her coffee cup down carefully, as if afraid she might spill it. The words hung between them, thick with implication. You, she started, then stopped, trying to process what he was saying. You recommended us? After everything? JD offered a small smile, his gaze steady. Because of everything, he corrected. I came here looking for a meal, and instead I found a place that mattered. Even when you turned me away, I could see it. The way your staff looked up to you. The way this place feels like more than just a restaurant. And I know what it's like to run something with your whole heart, to build something out of nothing. It's not easy. You've kept this diner going even when it's been hard, and I respect that. Melissa's fingers curled slightly against the table. Her initial instinct was to reject the very idea of it. She wasn't looking for a handout. She had built this place through sweat and sacrifice, not because someone had swooped in and offered help. But at the same time, she knew the reality of her situation. Before all of this, before the controversy, before the sudden influx of business, she had been barely scraping by. The roof needed repairs. The kitchen equipment was outdated. Her staff deserved higher wages. And now, here was JD Vance, the man she had turned away, offering something she never would have expected. What's the catch? She asked, her voice quieter now, wary but no longer dismissive. JD shook his head. No catch, no ownership stake, no interference, just investment. Enough to upgrade the kitchen, expand if you wanted to, offer more stable jobs. The only thing they ask is that you hire a few more employees and provide health benefits to your full-time staff. Melissa swallowed hard. The idea of it was overwhelming, almost too much to take in. She had spent years fighting for this diner, believing that she had to do it alone. But now she was staring at an opportunity she had never imagined, one that had come from the very person she had once refused to serve. She glanced at Talia, whose expression was a mix of quiet encouragement and awe, then at Eliza, who simply nodded as if to say, "This is yours to decide." Melissa exhaled, shaking her head slightly. I don't know what to say. JD gave her a small smile. You don't have to say anything yet. Just think about it. And for the first time in a long time, Melissa realized that maybe, just maybe, accepting help wasn't the same as giving up control. Maybe it was just another way of standing strong. Melissa lay awake long after the diner had closed for the night, staring at the ceiling as JD's words replayed in her mind. The idea of taking the investment was both exhilarating and terrifying. On one hand, it was everything she had dreamed of, money to fix the things that had been breaking down for years, the chance to expand, to hire more help, to finally give her employees the stability they deserved. But on the other hand, it felt like stepping into unknown territory, like surrendering a part of what had made Maple Creek Diner hers. Would accepting the money change the diner? Would it change her? Would people see her differently, think she had compromised her principles? Would she be able to look at herself the same way, knowing that the opportunity had come from someone she had once refused to serve? The next morning she gathered her staff before opening, her hands clasped together as she faced them. The usual morning chatter was absent. Everyone knew why they were here. They had all seen the way she had struggled to keep the diner afloat, had watched as she scraped by, sometimes delaying paychecks just to cover the bills. And now she was about to tell them that things could change. "I need to talk to you all about something," she started, exhaling slowly. JD Vance, he recommended us for an investment fund that helps small businesses like ours. She saw the way heads lifted, eyes widened, quiet murmurs passing through the group. "It's not a buyout," she clarified quickly. "It's just financial backing. Enough to renovate the kitchen, expand into the empty storefront next door, hire more people. And it comes with one condition. We'd have to offer health insurance to full-time employees." That last part sent a ripple through the staff, not of resistance, but of cautious hope. Danny, one of the longest-serving waitresses, was the first to speak. "Health insurance?" she echoed, exchanging glances with the others. "Melissa, that would be huge. You know most of us don't have that." Melissa nodded, pressing her lips together. "I know." Talia, standing near the counter, crossed her arms. "Then what's stopping you?" Melissa hesitated. It feels like a big change," she admitted, running a hand over the back of her neck. "I built this place from the ground up. I fought for every single thing we have. And now, this offer, it almost feels like I'm letting someone else take over, like I'm losing control of what makes the diner ours." Hector, the head cook, finally spoke, his deep voice calm. "Melissa, it's not about control. It's about survival." She swallowed hard. She had spent so long believing that the only way to survive was to do it alone. But maybe, just maybe, survival meant knowing when to accept a helping hand. Maybe it meant trusting that Maple Creek Diner wouldn't lose its soul just because it was finally allowed to grow. Melissa stood at the center of the diner just before opening, the morning sunlight filtering through the windows, casting long shadows across the freshly wiped tables. Her staff had gathered around her, a mix of curiosity and quiet anticipation in their faces. She had made up her mind. After nights of sleepless reflection, after countless conversations with Talia, after rereading JD's letter more times than she cared to admit, she knew what she had to do. She exhaled, gripping the edge of the counter as if grounding herself. "I've made a decision," she said, her voice steady but carrying the weight of everything that had led to this moment. "Starting today, Maple Creek Diner will serve everyone, no exceptions, no matter their politics, their beliefs, or what they stand for. If they walk through that door, they get a meal." A beat of silence followed before Danny, arms crossed, raised an eyebrow. "So, we're doing the exact opposite of what got us into this mess." Melissa met her gaze. "Yeah," she admitted, nodding, "because I was wrong." She glanced around the room, making eye contact with each of them. "I thought I was making a stand. I thought I was protecting something, but all I did was create more division. And that's not what this place is about." Talia was the first to smile, nodding in quiet approval. Hector grunted, arms folded, before muttering, "About damn time." Even Danny, ever skeptical, shrugged and said, "Well, it's a diner. Diners are for everyone." As word spread, customers reacted with a mix of surprise and understanding. Some regulars nodded approvingly, as if they had expected Melissa to come around. Others hesitated, still holding on to their opinions about what had happened. But gradually, as the smell of fresh coffee and sizzling bacon filled the air, the diner settled back into what it had always been, a place where people gathered, where conversations flowed over plates of pancakes and meatloaf, where differences could exist without tearing people apart. And as Melissa stood behind the counter, watching familiar faces mix with new ones, she felt something she hadn't in weeks. Peace. Months after Melissa's decision to serve everyone, regardless of their political beliefs, Maple Creek Diner had undergone a transformation, not just in its policies, but in its very foundation. The once small, struggling restaurant had become something bigger, something that symbolized more than just good food. With the investment fund JD had connected her to, Melissa had been able to make long overdue renovations. The kitchen had been upgraded with new appliances that made life easier for Hector and his team. The leaky roof had been fixed, and the empty storefront next door had been converted into a new dining space, nearly doubling their capacity. For the first time in years, Melissa wasn't worried about making ends meet. Instead, she was hiring. The expansion meant more jobs: 2 new cooks, 3 new waitresses, and a part-time dishwasher. It also meant something Melissa had never been able to offer before: health insurance for her full-time employees. When she had sat down to tell them about it, she had braced for skepticism, but instead she saw something else in their faces: relief. Danny, who had worked at the diner for years, teared up as she realized she wouldn't have to skip doctor's appointments anymore. Hector, usually stoic, gave Melissa a nod of appreciation before getting back to work as if nothing had happened. The changes didn't just affect the diner, they rippled through the entire town. More customers meant more business for the bakery down the street, which supplied their fresh bread daily. The increased traffic brought in visitors who stopped by the hardware store or grabbed gas before heading back home. Even the motel on the edge of town started seeing weekend travelers who had heard about the diner that went viral. The story of Maple Creek Diner had turned into something much bigger than a political controversy. It had become a place people wanted to experience for themselves, a symbol of second chances and community. At first, not everyone was on board. Some locals still viewed Melissa's change of heart with skepticism, quietly wondering if she had been pressured into it. But over time, as they saw the diner continue to thrive, as they realized it was still the same place that had been serving them for years, their reservations faded. The arguments that had once divided the town slowly dulled. The same people who had taken sides on social media were now sitting across from each other in booths, sharing plates of biscuits and gravy without a second thought. The diner had returned to what it had always been, meant to be, a place where people came together, no matter their differences. One morning, as Melissa poured herself a cup of coffee before the doors opened, she looked around the diner and felt something she hadn't in a long time: pride. Not just in the business, but in what it represented. She had spent years believing that standing firm meant refusing to change. But now, as she watched her employees laughing together, as she saw familiar faces mixing with new ones, she realized the truth. Sometimes standing strong meant being willing to grow. JD Vance returned to Maple Creek Diner a few weeks after the dinner, walking in without fanfare, without cameras. Just a man looking for a good meal in a place that had once turned him away. Melissa had seen him through the window before he stepped inside, her fingers tightening around the coffee pot she had been refilling. There was a time when she would have braced herself for conflict, when she would have seen him as an adversary rather than just another customer, but tonight she simply nodded as he approached the counter. "The usual?" she asked, raising an eyebrow. JD chuckled, sliding into the booth by the window, the same one he had tried to sit in the first time he came in. "You remember what I ordered?" Melissa smirked, pouring him a fresh cup of coffee before he could even ask. "You seem like a 2 eggs over easy wheat toast and crispy bacon kind of guy." "That obvious, huh?" "Yeah," JD said, shaking his head as he stirred a packet of sugar into his coffee. Their interactions had changed since that night. The tension that once crackled between them had softened into something else. Not quite friendship, but something close. They still didn't agree on everything, probably never would, but there was an understanding between them now, a recognition that they were both more than the labels people had given them. Over time, JD's visits became more frequent. Whenever he was in town, he made a point to stop by, sometimes alone, sometimes with a colleague, but always with the same easy demeanor. At first, their conversations were light, sticking to safe topics: how business was going, how the renovations were coming along, how the town was changing. But as the months passed, the discussions grew deeper. JD would ask about the challenges of running a small business, and Melissa, never one to sugarcoat reality, would tell him the truth about what it was like to scrape by, about the pressure of keeping people employed, about the constant worry of making ends meet. In return, JD talked about the struggles he had seen in communities like hers, about the policies he believed could help places like Maple Creek thrive. They didn't always see eye to eye, but they listened to each other, and in a world where people rarely did that anymore, it was enough. One evening, as JD finished his coffee and Melissa wiped down the counter, he leaned forward slightly, watching her with a small smile. "You know, you've changed," he remarked. Melissa snorted, tossing her rag over her shoulder. "So have you." JD laughed. "I don't know about that, but I do know that what happened here, that first night, the fallout, everything, it could have made things worse. It could have made us both dig our heels in, turn this into just another fight. But instead, he gestured around the diner where people sat at booths, some discussing local gossip, others lost in their own worlds. Instead, it became something else." Melissa followed his gaze, taking in the scene. The diner was busier than it had ever been, not just because of the investment, but because of what it had come to represent. It was no longer just a battleground in a political argument. It was a place where people could come together, where differences weren't erased but respected. She sighed, crossing her arms. "Guess that means you'll be coming back again?" JD grinned, tossing a few bills onto the counter. "I think you're stuck with me." Melissa shook her head, but this time there was no resistance, no hesitation. Just a quiet acceptance that people could be complicated, that change didn't always come easy, but that respect, real respect, wasn't about agreement. It was about showing up, about listening, about recognizing that sometimes the most meaningful bridges were built over plates of eggs and coffee. The story of Melissa and JD Vance at Maple Creek Diner carries a powerful lesson about human connection, understanding, and the ability to change. In today's world, where divisions run deep and conversations often turn into arguments, their journey reminds us that respect is not about agreement. It is about listening, about seeing the humanity in others, even when we don't share their beliefs. This is something that resonates deeply, especially for those who have lived long enough to see how the world has changed, how people have grown apart over things that, in the end, may not matter as much as they seem to in the moment. For many seniors, this story is a reflection of the values they grew up with, the idea that a handshake meant something, that neighbors helped each other regardless of differences, and that community was built on relationships, not politics. There was a time when people could sit at the same table, break bread together, and have a civil conversation, even if they didn't vote the same way or share the same views. Melissa's journey from rejection to acceptance reminds us that it's never too late to open our hearts, to reconsider our choices, and to find common ground with those we once thought were too different from us. One of the most important takeaways from this story is the idea that kindness is not weakness. JD could have responded to Melissa's rejection with anger, with a call for retaliation, with divisive words that would have only deepened the rift. Instead, he responded with grace, choosing to highlight the good in her diner rather than focusing on the moment of hostility. And in doing so, he changed not just the diner, but the entire town. His response reminds us of an old truth. We cannot control how others treat us, but we can always control how we respond. When we choose kindness, we set the tone for something better. Melissa's realization also teaches us that holding on to pride too tightly can prevent us from seeing the bigger picture. She thought she was making a stand, protecting her principles, but in doing so, she lost sight of what her diner was really about: serving people, bringing them together. It was only when she let go of her rigid stance and opened herself up to a conversation that she was able to see the opportunity in front of her. This is a reminder that sometimes we must pause and ask ourselves, are we holding on to something because we truly believe in it, or because we're afraid of being wrong? Growth doesn't mean abandoning our values. It means learning, adjusting, and becoming better versions of ourselves. For those in their later years, this story is also a call to reflection. What are the bridges that have been burned over disagreements? Are there relationships that could be mended if only one person took the first step toward understanding? Often, with age, comes the wisdom to realize that the small things we let divide us are just that, small. What matters most in the end is love, friendship, and the moments we share with others. Life is too short to let anger or pride keep us from the connections that make it meaningful. Perhaps the most touching part of this story is Eliza and Beverly's friendship, a bond that transcended time. It reminds us that the values we pass down, kindness, resilience, the importance of second chances, live on through the generations. JD didn't just learn grace on his own, he learned it from his grandmother. Just as Melissa learned from Eliza, in our own lives, we have the power to shape the future through the lessons we teach our children and grandchildren. If we teach them to react with understanding rather than hostility, if we show them that kindness is always an option, we leave behind a legacy far greater than anything material. In the end, Maple Creek Diner is more than just a place. It's a symbol of what can happen when people choose to bridge their differences rather than widen them. It's a reminder that no matter how divided things may seem, there is always a path toward reconciliation. And sometimes, that path starts with something as simple as an open door, a shared meal, and the willingness to listen.